All right, welcome everyone to 504's, IEPs, Health Plans, oh my. I'm Chanda. I feel like I've met all of you, but I'll say it anyway. I'm Chanda. I'm educator by training and trade, and special ed and civil rights law around these issues is something that comes on my desk regularly. So I find it to be a very entertaining topic, and hopefully we can kind of help all of you with some of the challenges that you're having in schools. Ryan's with me as well.
Ryan, I help high school students learn biology, IEP, bio.
So he gets to implement 504s and IEP, so that's an important perspective. So I know you probably all came with questions, and we definitely want to spend time on that, but I think the one I've heard a lot from people so far is what is the difference between a 504 and IEP and what is better? Is that a question you all have? Do you want me to speak to it, or should we just move right into questions? Your call. You want me to speak to it? Okay. Set the clock for like 3 minutes. If I go longer than that, stop me. Okay, so 504s, IEPs, what is better? The answer is always it depends. And if anyone tells you one is better than the other, it better be specific to your child's case. If it's a general rule, then they probably don't know all the ins and outs. It 100% depends. IEPs come out of U.S. Department of Education. It is special education law. It applies to K-12 public schools only. If you are in private school, if you are outside of K-12, none of those laws or regulations apply. 504 is civil rights law. It comes out of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that applies to school places, workplaces, post-secondary education, pretty much everywhere. When you come into a school, a lot of times our kiddos in particular are going to need some sort of support to access the regular curriculum, and that's essentially what both of these programs are about. How do we make sure that your child has the same access to learning as every other child in the school? And so what's the difference? And so essentially the bottom line difference by federal law is that a 504 is an accommodation that someone needs to access the environment. So wheelchair access to the classroom, large print books, AC in the classroom, those sorts of things. What is it that they need to access the regular curriculum? An IEP is for kids who need specialized instruction. So in addition to needing supports and accommodations to access the regular curriculum isn't enough. And they need extra supports to be able to learn, and therefore they need specialized instruction. The rule of thumb a lot of schools use, which could be debatable whether it's right or wrong, is are they behind academically? If they're behind academically, they get an IEP. If they're not, they get a 504. It's not a perfect rule of thumb, but it kind of puts that into perspective, what you're thinking, what you would be thinking about. Many schools, so many of our kids, particularly if they have co-occurring things going on, technically would qualify for both an IEP and a 504. And there are many districts who implement it that way. They say your pieces that are just accessing regular curriculum go in 504. So for example, if they have a specific like literacy identified challenge, those literacy pieces might be listed in the IEP. The math access curriculum might be listed in a 504. If you're going to be authentic to the laws, that's what you do. For a lot of school systems, that's a lot. For families, that's a lot, managing two plans. So some school systems will do an IEP, even if maybe a 504 would have done it for pieces of it. If there's any part that qualifies for an IEP, they'll give you an IEP. That's not right or wrong. It's not a bad thing. A lot of people say IEPs are enforceable, 504s are not. I'm telling you that's false, and if your school system is telling you that, go to your local civil rights office and get yourself some support because they will help you fight that. Both are absolutely enforceable. Both have to have families at the table when you're making them. Both are about accessing supports. The one advantage I would say of a 504 over an IEP is that follows the child to college and to workplace. So when you set up that plan, K-12, that child can then take it to their university if they decide to go to post-secondary training, and that university has to honor it. They can have 504 meetings and decide about accommodations just like you do in K-12, but it applies once they get out of school. IEPs, once they're out of public K-12 schools, they're done, they're gone, supports are done. There are lots of programs usually to support, but from a law perspective, the rights are gone. So that's kind of my 10-second overview. What I will say is these laws are incredibly complex. I had a training this year. It was 12 hours altogether. It covered only the new legislative changes to 504s. That's the only thing it covered. Incredibly complex, incredibly challenging. I will say school systems, and you have federal law, but then each state kind of has a different way in which they implement it, and then each school has a different system, right? The federal law says they have to have a system. What it looks like is up to the local public school. So it makes it super hard for families like us, because how I access a 504 might be completely different than how you all access a 504 based on our local school system. And schools are doing the best they can, but it's incredibly complex, and they don't always do it well, and they don't always do it right, which is why it's important for you kind of to know what your rights are as parents and be sure that you can kind of fight for them and push back when maybe they're not applying it as well as they should. So.
No, I was just giving you 5-minute cutoff. Okay.
Done, and that was like a dissertation in 5 minutes. So what questions do you have?
So we have been on the 504 through the elementary school. Now we are moving into middle school. And while we were still in elementary school, my daughter got tested, and she was borderline for IEP, and we were offered an IEP at the time. And when we asked what additional services would be provided, there was basically, it would be all the same. So we opted not to go into IEP at the time. Now that we are moving into middle school and things are a bit more formal, we are reconsidering whether we should put her on IEP versus 504. So my question is that as far as the 504 goes, what things can we actually put in terms of academics? So she's behind on math. And one of the things that is available in our school is the class with 2 teachers. So it's possibly better student-to-teacher ratio. Could that be enforced through the 504, or do we need to be on IEP, for example, to enforce something like that?
So what I would say is every school system will do it a little differently. And so a follow-up question I might have is the room where you have 2 teachers, is it a different type of instruction? It's
exactly
just a different student-teacher ratio. Okay. So, and that's what the important difference is this specialized instruction. And so if your child is behind in math and it is their health issue that is relating to it, and it's one of the 13, so what's interesting about IEPs is there are only 13 diagnoses that a child has to have in order to get an IEP. Step 1 is, do they have one of these diagnoses? Step 2 is it impacting their academics? And that's the qualification procedure. So it sounds like maybe your school system is kind of thinking, she probably has one of these 13. One of the 13 is like other health issues, other health impairment, thank you. And you can see how I generalize it. And so all of our kids apply under that part. It's the second piece that we kind of, so it's not wrong that they're thinking IEP, 504, does it matter? I'm not sure it matters. What matters is, does your kid get what they need to get?
I guess they are resisting to putting her into that class.
Putting into that class, okay.
Right, so my question is that, if we are just on a 504, can we request it? And what rights do we have?
Yeah, so any placement and any services your child receives is a collective decision of the group, whether it is a 504 or an IEP. You have processes by which you can appeal their decisions, but at the end of the day, it's a team decision, and you as the parent have some input in that, but you do not have the final say. It's a team final say, it's a collective. So I would, if I were you, I would sit down with your team and I might before kind of reach out to individual teachers to say, where are you with this? Where are you with this? What are you thinking? What does she need? So that then you can kind of have started that conversation. And at the table, my question would be, my child is behind in math. What are we going to do to support her? Because whether that is the separate class and if they're saying no, they don't want to do that, then my question would be, okay, then how are you going to catch her up? Because that, at the end of the day, is what the purpose of a 504 and IEP is. How do you get children to where everybody else is? And so sometimes it's through that line of questioning that you can push them towards Yes, she needs this. So when they say, well, yeah, so we're gonna give her an extra 10 minutes a day of this instruction, I would look at them and say, well, my child missed 40 days of school this year. So that would be 40 hours of extra specialized instruction that you were gonna give her for catch up. Maybe that's not enough. Can we talk about something else? So I would kind of push the line of thinking.
One of the things that they said will give her 50% extra time on the homework. And to me, I don't quite understand what that means, because if the homework is 1 day, what is 50% extra will do? A half a day, she gets to turn it in by the end of the school day rather than the beginning?
No, and that's a great point. So I would always push on that issue. Homework should always be practice. It should not be instruction. I should never send home homework that the kids have not already learned. Homework is, I'm now going to practice this thing I know. And so if your child is behind and they need to catch up, homework isn't helping. Now, an accommodation for extra time on homework for a kid that misses a lot of school is probably a good accommodation, but that's not going to catch up. That's not going to catch up on their academics. So I might take that. Yes, please. And that's great that she has extra time to practice, but what are we going to do about the skills gap? That's a great word. Write that one down. They love that one. Skills gap, catch-up growth. These are like catchphrases for educators. Accessing the curriculum. Like, you start bringing that out and they're like, oh, these people have been reading. Yeah, so how are we going to catch her up? Extra homework isn't going to do it. That's practice. So what's the instruction that's going to catch her up? And push that line of thinking until you get some kind of support that's going to catch her up, whether that be that system or something that you're comfortable with. Does that help at all? Okay. What else can we help with? Or at least have sympathy for.
Okay, so this kind of goes off of what you were talking about yesterday at the other deep dive of missing school. We all have that reality of doctor's appointments, if not hospital stays. Does that fall under like the specialized programs, or do we just have to simply bite the bullet and have excused absences medically and have a child miss 3 weeks of school and take it on us to help them catch up?
So that's great. One of the things that we worked into our 504 with our daughter was in our school, if you had 10 consecutive days of absence, then you qualified for some sort of additional tutoring services. Well, our kids, it may not necessarily be 10 consecutive days of absence, but we have lots and lots of absences. So one of our accommodations is after 10 absences total, we can access those tutoring services if they're needed. So that was something that was, this thing's available, but how can we take that and tweak that a little bit to help our situation?
Yeah, but I like your question, though, about what's the school's responsibility versus what's my responsibility at home. And what I will say is that the school has responsibility to get your kid to be on what we call on grade level. The one thing I would just maybe add, because this was a mind blower for me as I came into administration, is that IEP law and 504 law is designed to level the playing field. It is not designed to give your child everything they need to succeed. And I like to think in schools we're always giving every child what they need to succeed, but realistically, that isn't really feasible in our political environment. So we can't give 5 kids to every teacher. Like, it's just not. We can't do that. So it's leveling the playing field. How do we make sure that your child has as much chance of success as every other child in this school? So sometimes when we go into 504 meetings, we're like, we want this and this and this and this. It's like, well, but is that more than what an average child would be getting? Like, is that, they're not overly, which is really hard when you're the parent to sit there and say, but I want everything for my child. But to your point, your school has the obligation to get your child to on grade level, where we want them to be. The question is, do you want them to be doing it? And that's kind of the question. So Ryan said we have that accommodation. Kate missed, I think, 40 days this year or something like that. Not very many in a row. On a good year when they're healthy, they have, I think she has 12 just for specialist appointments, So we did not take advantage of tutoring this year because she was a little behind, but she wasn't that far behind. And we felt like the day she was home, she really just needed to rest. And so I didn't want to be doing tutoring as well. So to a certain degree, you kind of have to decide as a parent, to what degree do I want the school involved in this? And sometimes you know, depending on what's going on and depending on your skills and depending on your resources, you may want them involved. We're super lucky. She is home all day. When she stays home, she's home with grandma. Grandma taught first grade for 37 years. Like, she's good. You know, or she's home with grandma who taught kindergarten for 34 years. Not that we can actually teach her anything because she thinks we know nothing, but we try. So we didn't feel like you know, if I was in a different situation, I might have taken those tutoring services, but she wasn't that far behind. I felt like with a little time she would catch up, and by the end of the year she did. She hit a little good stretch and she caught up, and we're really happy. But, you know, I would think about, you don't want whatever the school is giving you to make your life harder. And sometimes it is. It's like, okay, well, then bring them into school for a half day every summer and we're going to do some catch-up work. Like, well, that's all well and good, but do you have transportation? Do you have daycare for the other half of the day? Do you have those things? And so, you know, because you work. Yeah, exactly. And as most of us do. So, you know, the school is doing what they can do, but sometimes, you know, I have plenty of families. We offer many summer programs. We do offer transportation to ours for kids who need catch-up, not just 504 IEP kids. But I have families that say, you know what, it's summer. I just want my kid home, and I'll do work with them at home. And so then we say, okay, so what do you need? Like, you know, copies of whatever texts or textbooks, like particularly for young readers, like getting a high volume of books into their home. So we'll send home a box of books with them to be like, here, read. What else have we done to kind of try to, it's learning that we're facilitating, but the school is supporting and trying to coordinate. She videoed into school on days she was out and just was too tired. We did that one day a week. Pros and cons on that. I mean, on Wednesdays, they were half days anyway. Like, and then half of that is lunch and recess, so she really wasn't missing much. I hope her teachers aren't watching. So that works okay. Pretty good.
For me, when I was younger, I had, I think, a week out of school or 2 weeks out of school. And the school solution was, hey, here's a week's worth of crap. Gave it to my parents. My parents, fortunately, were able to stay home and teach and help me with that stuff. But I'm looking at my son, and it's like, if the school drops a week's worth of 8th grade math in my lap, I'm a couple years removed from that. I'm not teaching my son math, especially when I have 3 other kids that I'm helping with homework that they know how to do. And so is that beyond my expectation to say to the school, hey, I'm not teaching them, you're going to teach them, I'll help them with the homework, but don't give me a week's worth of work to do in 3 days' time?
It's the difference between practice and instruction. We are happy to support practice at home. Instruction should be, to a degree, the responsibility of the school. So the question I would follow up with, okay, thank you so much for this work. How are you going to help him learn it? You know, what are we going to do?
Legally, I can kind of stand there and say, hey, I'm not obligated to teach them. I have some footing legally with the laws in place to say, no, you guys need to provide some kind of instruction in conjunction with this material.
Yeah, so under 504 law, civil rights, he has a right to access education. In this case, education. It's accessing a lot of different things, but in this case, education. And so if his health impairment is creating such that he cannot access that, the school is obligated to provide accommodations for that. So that is kind of your legal standing. Again, what they want to provide might be, you know, they might send home like, oh, okay, do ABC mouse. Like, oh, okay. I've had kids for whom that really worked. I don't know. So it's definitely then becomes a negotiation of what that thing is and does it fit into your life. But yes, your child has a right to access, whether it's IEP or 504, your child has a right to access a free and public education. It's known as FAPE. If they ever throw that word around, that's what it means, a free access to public education. Free and appropriate, sorry.
I'm a teacher as well, but they can have home instructors come to your house. In Ohio, I know that they do at our school, that they can come and provide that education for an hour a week or an hour a day or however much you need. They can do that.
Oh, you'll struggle if your kid is ahead. if your kid's, and it's like Molly made me think of it as a gifted teacher. If your kid's ahead, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time convincing the school to come in and give you extra support for instruction. But if your kid's behind, like you are in solid legal ground, like you can go in there with pitchforks practically if you need to. But I mean, they should be supporting no matter what. Your argument's going to be stronger when they're.
Okay, so in Ohio, you start with a Help Me Grow program from birth to age 3. Once they turn age 3, they get IEPs through their home school. So my son is 4 and he has an IEP, but our Help Me Grow person, I don't know. I don't love labels, but they are what they are, so we can accept them. But she suggested there's a lot of things my son does that he ticks a lot of boxes for autism and he ticks a lot of boxes for ADHD. My personal opinion is the ADHD is not true ADHD. It is, he's itching, and so that's distracting to him, and so he's not paying attention. So it's not he has ADHD. I don't think, or at least not at this point, I don't feel like it's ADHD-like. But they suggested, like, maybe you should allow them to give them diagnoses because they're more widely recognized, and it'll be easier access to services and more services available. Where I don't.
Fascinating. It's really interesting. So what I would say is we have found actually a lot of the physical accommodations related to ADHD has really helped our kiddo in the classroom. So when you're itchy, you tend to move, and we have lots of accommodations really well established for ADHD, right? Like bouncy chairs or tippy chairs or things to rub your feet on, and for Kate, that's actually really helped. And so, and I think it was her kindergarten teacher maybe that came forward with, I know she doesn't have ADHD, but I'm just wondering if these things might help. And we have found that they have helped. So I'm not totally shocked they've gone down that road. So their point is well taken. Yes, when you say here's an ADHD kid, a teacher is going to say, I always say a child who has, but anyway. I know what works for this child, and I'm going to use these skills. And so it's not a bad thing when it comes to the physical accommodations. My concern would be they're also making assumptions about how their brain is working and firing and what parts are talking to each other.
And at 4, that's not all incorrect. Mm-hmm. Because the itching is distracting. He's not paying attention to the teachers as much because he is sitting there looking at this one spot on his foot that looks really extra itchy right now, and how can he get to it in the best way? So there is a lot of those, like...
The behaviors are there.
The behaviors are there too, but they're not... I don't want him to get led down this ADHD path that I don't know when he gets older if it's going to look
like
as
that.
AD,
Yeah, and so that's my concern is like when you're talking about, brain-based learning and really looking at, what is it about an ADHD brain and how is that firing and how is that different than a neurotypical kid and how is that different than a kid who has maybe autism spectrum, and it's this incredibly fascinating science. My concern would be if you're, well, why don't we just, put him in that diagnosis and then he'll have services, but will the services meet the needs in this case of his brain, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to it, and maybe Molly, you could as well. I would have some concerns about that.
Yeah, I would have concerns. I wouldn't put the label of the ADHD on there. The school should be able to, hey, I need these services because he has to sit in this kind of a chair for the 504 to put on there. Yeah, I would not have that ADHD label because that's not, his brain is not ADHD. His behavior, because he's itching, is ADHD. So yeah, I wouldn't put that.
I'd also like to just add, with that label, I understand your concern because I work in mental health and especially drug addiction. And, instantly when we see a kid with ADHD, now we go to doctors and they say, well, why don't you have them on Ritalin? Why don't you have them on something? It's like, well, because they don't have ADHD. Well, why are they diagnosed with ADHD? I'm calling CYS or Child Protective Services because you're not providing the medical treatment that this child is supposed to have based off of this diagnosis. And then you get into this whole lifelong issue of, well, when I was 4 years old, I was on Ritalin and now I'm addicted to speed. Which, it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough that I have a job. So That's one of my concerns with an improper labels too. So, I would agree with them. Don't accept the label. Just write it in. He needs these accommodations because of this issue.
And then I have one more question. So okay.
Sorry. Has he done a full evaluation with a school psychologist, like a psych examiner?
No.
Because that would be, so that might be what I push for, is say, okay, I'm interested in to know why you think this. I would like him to be evaluated by a psych examiner, because those are the folks that get into it. Okay, so we see these behaviors. What's that little brain doing? And then they'll be able to come and say, yeah, he's neurotypical, he just has behaviors. Or, this is what we think his brain is doing. And then maybe it is, but that's the person that's going to be able to really tell you what's happening.
Right. So then I have one other question, and I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this. So the elementary school he goes to does not have air conditioning, but there are other elementary schools in the district that do. No, he is.
Our warrior adult over here is like losing her mind about that idea.
Yeah, no, he loves to be cold too. Yeah, he prefers to be cold and warm. But there are other elementary schools in the school district that I don't like as much that have air conditioning. Can I make them put like a window air conditioner in his designated school, or can they say, no, we're going to provide transportation to school B?
Technically and functionally is how I'm going to answer this question. Technically, what you would need is a strong supporting document from your medical team that your child, in order to support their health and their learning, needs to be in a cool environment. So that is going to be your step one to push this issue. You then could stand on ground that says your child has a health impairment if they're IEP or a health diagnosis under 504, and they need to access the regular curriculum. And that is not specialized instruction, and therefore they shouldn't have to go to another school. There is an accommodation you could make in their home school, and therefore they should do that. So I would fight it. I would fight it hard. It doesn't totally apply, but I would maybe throw in a little least restrictive environment. Have you guys heard that word? So it's this idea that we are giving kids with one of the 13 diagnoses under IDEA, so special education, the support they need, but in the least restrictive environment. So we're not saying, okay, Anna, you learn differently. You're going, you need 5 extra minutes in your test. You're going to a special school. You're going to go to a separate place where we put all those kids that need 5 minutes. Least restrictive environment means we have them access the regular classroom in their regular school as much as possible.
His older brother's already going to the school.
And so that's a great argument. So the comment was that his older brother already goes to that school, so that you can kind of add that in as well. If he has an IEP, you can totally throw least restrictive environment around. With a 504, it's a little, but I'd still try. So I would push and I would fight hard for he needs an accommodation to be in the environment that he's in. And this is what it is. But you're going to need the medical documentation to back up that says he needs to be in a cool environment to learn. Yeah.
Okay, so from experience of having to advocate for a cool environment, so when I was in high school, there was a classroom that the whole school had AC, but one month it was broken in this one classroom, and they tried to just not tell us. And so when I went to advocate for myself, because it was high school, they just said they were going to get a fan. I don't know if any of you have been in a hot room with a fan, but it literally just pushes around hot air. So when you talk to your doctor, make sure, because I know for us that's obvious, no, a fan, but their go-to will be a fan because it's cheap and it's easy and it's no problem whatsoever. So when you do talk to your doctor, make sure that they emphasize it needs to be a window unit. It needs to be bringing in cool air, not pushing around air.
Okay.
Yeah.
For my daughter, she also has temperature restrictions. So she can't go outside if it's under or above a certain temperature, and the same thing inside, so they will call and we'll have to pick her up, basically. But she does have AC. They actually got AC put into the school because they didn't have AC either. And the principal advocated for her and got it put into all of the classrooms that she has to go into. So that way she doesn't have to be separated from her class at any time. So if they've got it in the library, the gym, the lunchroom, the art room, and the music room, as well as her classroom.
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
So I was just gonna bring up real quick, so I know you talked about how when you have these meetings, it's a collaborative decision. What role does the child play, and how does that change over time, even though I know kind of the answer to that?
I feel like I want you to answer this question.
I can, but you have the technical.
Okay, so the technical side is the child has a right to attend any meeting that they want to attend, IEP or 504. I will say, as a young child, it is very difficult to process. I think Kate's come to one or two, and she mostly rolls her eyes because we're talking about her, and she's just like, whatever. But we do try to, but we always say, hey, we're having a meeting about your learning. Do you want to come? Most of the time, she's like, what are we doing? I'm like, well, we're going to sit around a table and we're going to talk about you. And she's like, yeah, pass. So that's fine. And she's going into third grade. I'm going to allow that for a little longer. She starts getting to fourth grade, fifth grade, middle school. That's when you really need to start pushing that, like, this is your learning. Like, you need to come to the table. And if the educators around the table are not saying to your child, what do you think, then take that role on yourself. We say, oh, we're thinking about this accommodation. I would be the one around the table if as an educator, we do this. I'm sure Ryan does it. If they aren't, as a parent, I would be saying, well, Anna, what do you think about that? Like, how do you feel about this thing we're talking about? And it's the same, you're going to be used to this because it's the same as in doctor's offices, right? There are a whole bunch of people sitting around and talking about your child while they're in the room and talking about them and not to them. So it's all those challenges as well. But when they get to high school, like, it's a non-negotiable that they're at those meetings. And if your school tries to tell you the child is not allowed, like, double down on that one. I will send you the legislation that says the child can be there. There are schools I've heard that have done that. Teachers don't want to be saying that they want to say things about the child when the child can't defend themselves, and that absolutely has happened. It happens in my district. You better believe they get strongly worded things from me when that happens. So kids can be there, they should be there, and particularly when they get to high school, they have to be there, because when they get to college, you're not going to be there. Or whatever post-secondary environment they decide to go to, you're not going to be there. And if they don't know what those things are that have been helping them, that were just there and they didn't know they were there, they're not going to be able to advocate for themselves. So you got to kind of start training that advocacy young. As I said, I let Kate come anytime she wants to right now, but I don't make her. Middle school, we'll start to make her. High school, it's non-negotiable. She is there and she is at the table and part of the decision-making process. You had a question.
How detailed should IEPs be without making them so restrictive that it kind of defeats the purpose? Like, Noelle's allowed to have a scribe, so if she gets tired of writing. She has a one-on-one aide that goes with her everywhere anyways, and that's been very helpful. She's allowed to have a scribe for testing, just general work, But how detailed should it be about scribes or any other thing in the IEP, again, without making it just so restrictive? It just defeats the whole purpose of it even being in there.
So, did you like that? He complains I talk a lot, but I just would like that noted right there. So that is like the $1 million question. So anything you want to be able to enforce later, you want to make sure is in there and is explicit. So for us, if it's over, I don't remember what degree we put in there, she doesn't go outside for recess. That's in her IEP. If she misses more than 10 days, she gets tutoring services. That's in her IEP. 504, sorry, 504. So detailed as possible. However, the longer an IEP or a 504 gets, the more likely it is that we as a school are going to have a hard time implementing it. Ryan has 100 kids. 30% of them have an IEP or a 504. Hey, buddy. If every one of those is 20 pages long, and he's a teacher who puts in the time to read them. Hi, sweet boy. He's a teacher who puts in the time to read them. Most teachers are like, okay, what do I need to know? What do I need to know? And that's kind of what I had said about. And some, and sorry, the comment back here was that not all teachers have access, and that is true. Particularly like the first day of school, we'll go in and was like, so have you seen her 504? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, let me give you the highlights.
Yeah.
So, so from my opinion, it would be like, what are my top non-negotiables? And I'm gonna make sure those things are in there. And the rest of the things that are maybe not as important, I might do is just like a classroom teacher. We've agreed we're gonna do this. And if it gets to the point where like, wow, she absolutely has to have that, and now we're in a new classroom and the teacher's kind of fighting a little bit, like, okay, we're gonna put it in the 504. So it's a balance. As detailed as possible lets you enforce it better later because you're in a learning environment, it's going really great. Well, the next one might not be so accommodating. So you want it written, but just keep in the back of your mind that the longer it is, the harder it is for teachers to really do a good job knowing all the bits and pieces and implementing all the bits and pieces. So, what's your most important? Make sure those are in there. And then cheat sheets. I love a cheat sheet for a teacher. Here, Mr. Woodside, here are the 4 bullets you need to know. And go read the 504 when you have some time. But in biology, these are the 4 things that you need to know about my kid.
We meet every year before school with everybody, so it helps, like principal, nurse, teacher, everyone is there.
And that's an important point, that you have to have an IEP and a 504 meeting once a year. But as a parent, you can call one whenever you want. So if you're starting to see that these strategies aren't working, you can bring the team together to the table.
Yeah, you're right.
Thanks, Cory.
We're taking Court home with us. Just put it out there.
Yes.
I think we have, like 4 minutes?
Okay.
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay, 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments to everything from our experience is that the hardest time we had was actually with substitutes, PE teachers, and yard supervisors, because they don't get to see your 504s or IEPs. So if your child has something that's very necessary, have them hand it to them, or ask your teacher to write it. Some of our teachers were writing it on their desk, and basically there was a note with anything. The second one, I didn't realize, because our elementary school was so informal, that in middle school, before my daughter's going, I shot an email to a counselor and said, hey, I want to meet with you about my daughter that's coming. What I did not realize that I was coming into the 504 meeting. So it was very formal, and I felt woefully unprepared because I not expect it. So every meeting you request is the formal meeting. That's my understanding right now.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is more from an educational standpoint. My daughter has a very, very hard time writing. So when does an accommodation that may affect her ability to master a skill, when should you kind of enforce that? For example, I've heard a lot of people tell me, oh, she can use a computer. I do want her to learn how to write, although she hates it and it's not good because she has hand fatigue. But at what point should I push for the technical accommodation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Susan. These are all really great questions. So I would treat them as separate skills, right? So in writing as a craft classes, right, they're learning how to construct a paragraph and how to make sentences and all that stuff. Yeah, maybe she needs an accommodation that she's using a computer, or she needs a scribe or that sort of thing. But my follow-up question would be, okay, but now what are we going to do to develop her handwriting skills? Because that is also a skill. And maybe that means that they need some occupational therapy or even some physical therapy, or developing of, or even just what are we gonna do as an instructional plan? I think our school had Kate take 2 buckets and one full of water and one not full, and just take the sponge and squeeze it out and then fill it up and then squeeze. And she thought it was hilarious. She was building hand strength, right? And her writing is terrible. Her craft of writing is beautiful. Her handwriting is terrible. But she's worked really hard on it.
She's an OT as well, so.
Yeah, so I would bring it up to the OT, and then I would ask the school, what's our instructional plan to help build her handwriting skills? And there are lots of handwriting intervention programs. Learning Without Tears is a great one. which is like the worst name for an education program of all time. I think they just changed it. I don't know what the new one is. But they do, and they have an app, which is pretty good, that helps with it a little bit. But yeah, I would ask, what's our, great for the accommodations for these parts of learning, what's our instructional plan for helping her develop her handwriting?
So real quick, as your child gets older, be prepared to have a conversation about the plan that you've chosen for them. Be prepared for them to not agree with you, just because that's what they're going to do at first. So just putting that out there, it is going to make it more difficult as they get older and they understand what's going on, but please be patient with us, and please make sure that you do let them talk to you open and honestly, because you have to remember they are going to be in that school, living their life there with those accommodations, and then social things come into that. So just warning you, it's going to be okay, but they will. You need to have that conversation with them.
Awesome. Are we at time? Yeah. Pretty much. So thank you for listening. I don't know if this is on. Thank you, and I hope it was a little bit helpful. And I'm here. I'm going to volunteer Molly, who's been around. I think most of you have seen my mother. She is around. She's a career educator. Please grab any of us. Oh, there's another family here who are educators. There we go, educator. I do the earlier side, though. So perfect. Earlier side over here. Birth to 5. Perfect. We need a birth to 5 group, right? So grab us, and we'll help help you problem solve. And if it's even like, what's the language we should put in the 504, or what's the argument I need to make? Like, what are words I should use? Like, we can kind of help you with that a little bit. Thank you, everyone. Good luck.